old when I first heard Peggy Lee sing the song, Is That All There Is? It was in 1969, and I've always found that song to be one of the most plaintive and haunting songs that I know, filled with longing, angst, and pain, and an incredible sense of loss and sadness. In this song, which I'm sure all of you or most of you know, Peggy Lee sings of a number of significant experiences in her own life. A house fire, going to the circus as a child, falling in love as an adult. And at the end of each experience that she sings about, she expresses a great sense of emptiness, a feeling of disappointment, with the words, "Is that all there is?" Lee herself described the song in this way. She said, "It's about the experiences you go through in life that are necessary for growth. In some ways, it has paralleled my own life. It has a lot to do with how we survive." I think we could probably all say something like that. The longing we hear in this song, the yearning for je ne sais quoi, has been expressed in many ways in the history of humanity. By singers like Peggy Lee, by poets, by artists, musicians, philosophers, and theologians. In Hebrew scripture, for example, the psalmist often captures this same sense of yearning and longing for something. "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence does my help come?" And 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your weary souls." More than 1,500 years ago, St. Augustine, bishop, church father, and theologian, diagnosed the human predicament when he said to God, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." And about 1,000 years later, French philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal wrote, "What else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim, but that there was once in man, in humanity, a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are. Though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God." And fast forward another 500 years to the present time, and we hear Bono of U2 fame sing, "Looking for to save my soul, looking in the places where no flowers grow, looking for to fill that God-shaped hole." Bono is picking up here on a contemporary expression of or metaphor for the yearning in the human heart, which drives us on our spiritual quest, a God-shaped hole in the human heart. I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a sad story to me, but it has a point. Alan Jones, in his book, Reimagining Christianity, tells this story. Excuse me, and it's a story about a woman by the name of Helene Eilon. And she was an artist of Orthodox Jewish background in her 70s, living in New York City. And she was responsible for a controversial art installation at a Jewish community center in New York City on the subject of the Niddah, and that is the time of so-called impurity for a woman during menstruation. And the installation was called My Bridal Chamber. Now, the background to this art exhibit was the memory of her husband's death. Her husband was an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, and he died when she was only 29 years old. And because she was impure during her husband's final days, she says, we never held hands. We never even touched. Religious observance was more important than love. Well, it's no wonder that Aylan is ambivalent about her Jewish faith. She talks about her mother's faith and she talks about her faith tradition, but says of herself, but I have a hole in my soul. And I think she means two things by this. One, that there is still that God-shaped hole in her heart, in her soul, waiting to be filled. But also, secondly, in her case, that she cannot allow it to be filled by the God of her tradition, as she understands that and has experienced that. And so the hole in her heart has become a gaping, festering wound that may never heal. I told you it was a sad story. And it was on reading this story that I thought of another psalm, Psalm 43, a psalm like many of the other psalms of lament, a psalm of complaint against God and the world and anyone else who will listen. To God, the psalmist cries out, God, you are supposed to be my protector and my advocate. Why have you cast me off? Why have you abandoned me? And then, as if to himself, the psalmist moans, why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? It's as if the psalmist has recognized for the first time a hole in his heart, a hole that is supposed to be filled by God, but God is nowhere to be found. God is absent. When religious observance becomes more important than love, then religion begins to rot from within, and it deserves to die. That so-called God needs to be rejected. Now, sadly, we know that for some people, even the word God has become so toxic and so contaminated that it is no longer useful. The church, in God's name, has done much to contribute to this loss. Many people are not so much lapsed Christians as they are disappointed lovers, alternating between anger and sadness at the loss of or the betrayal by a loved one. And in this case, the loved one is the church. But there's something sad, even tragic, about how we deprive ourselves of the reminders and structures that we need in our lives, the symbols and the rituals that still have meaning for us, because we allow the worst of our tradition to set the agenda. On the one hand, we all know that religion at its best, at its very, very best, keeps us rooted and grounded, which we need. But on the other hand, those powerful roots, those same roots can engulf and strangle the life out of us. And so religion both includes and excludes. It inspires and it dumbs down. It gives life, and it also inflicts death. It seems to me that as crazy as religion makes us sometimes, I think it's here to stay. Human beings seem to be hardwired for it. And God's not going away either. The divine presence / absence is felt all over the world. And so simply believing in God is no big deal, and it's certainly not enough. Jesus says as much when he admonishes his followers, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the realm of heaven, but only those who do the will of God." I know lots of people, I'm sure we all do, who believe in God, and their belief, their religion, makes them judgmental and callous and hard-hearted and just plain mean. And I know many other people, on the other hand, who profess no religious belief at all, and yet who practice what I would call godly lives, lives of warmth and kindness and compassion. I don't think we need to be worried at all about the survival of Christianity. Christianity doesn't need anyone to save it. If it has any truth at all, if it is worth saving, then it will survive. And if it hasn't any truth, then it deserves to die. We'd be better off without it. We've all heard the analogy that nature abhors a vacuum. Well, if that analogy can be applied to our spiritual lives as well as to science, then we know that if that God-shaped hole in our hearts is not filled by God, and by God I mean something whole, something healing and life-giving, that some of us call God, but other people call other things. If it's not filled with that, then it will be filled by something else. And that something else may be an infatuation with material things. It may be workaholism. It may be substance abuse or destructive sexual activity or addictions of all kinds, things that are definitely not life-giving, but rather life-destroying. So what happens if we're fortunate enough and what happens in our lives when this God-shaped hole is filled by something that makes us feel truly alive? And as I said before, it doesn't really matter what we call it. We can call it God, and some of us do, but we don't have to. And it may be different for different people. In fact, it will be different for different people. It's what Viktor Frankl described in his account of his time in concentration camps. He speaks of something that he called the intensification of the inner life that some prisoners experienced, so that something as simple as a sunset, or the memory of a verse of poetry, or even the most ordinary actions of the past, like riding on a bus, or answering the telephone, or turning on the lights, becomes filled with beauty and longing. And so the operative word is not so much the word God, but what that word or that idea represents to people. Authenticity, honesty, gratitude, integrity, transformation, and love. We will fill that God-shaped hole in our hearts in a number of ways that are suited to our own experiences, our own traditions, and our own personalities. And often it's only in retrospect that we recognize it at all. For example, some people will use meditation and prayer as a way to fill that God-shaped hole. For other people, it's through action. It's through engaging in acts of compassion and justice and social action. For some, it's through participating in a faith community like this faith community with people who have similar values and beliefs as we do. Sometimes it's by immersing oneself in nature, by celebrating relationships of all kinds with lovers, with family, with friends. Joining in acts of corporate worship as we are here today. Engaging in ritual, symbol, meaning, art, music, dance, myth. This need that I'm talking about is underlined for me every time I preside at a funeral or a wedding or a baptism for people who haven't warmed a church pew in 25 years or a church chair. They may not always be able to articulate why, but in those life transitions, with all of the anxiety and the fear and the uncertainty that go with life transitions, people still seem to need the security, the groundedness of those rituals and symbols. Truth be told, I guess that God-shaped hole in the heart is never totally and permanently filled. Even my friends who call themselves atheists and agnostics are kind of like the Dublin taxi driver who, when asked if he believed in leprechauns, replied, "No, of course not, but they're there just the same." Someone has said that love is the highest form of knowledge. And the writer of 1 John in Christian scripture says simply, God is love. St. John of the Cross said, in the end, we shall be examined in love. There seems to be a thread here, doesn't there? And the thread is love. What most people need is less talk and more action. We don't need to be told, we need to be shown. We want to be able to taste, touch, hear, smell, and see the love for which we long, and of which the gospel of Jesus Christ speaks. As Eliza Doolittle sings in My Fair Lady, don't talk of love, show me. Maybe then we can tend to the God-shaped hole in our hearts. Thanks be to God.